Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Missouri Ozarks. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the early autumn of 1900, the river ran darker than usual. That was how the pilots described it in their logs, not higher, not faster, but darker. The Missouri River had always been unpredictable through the Ozark stretches, twisting between bluffs and wooded banks where lantern light barely carried. County shipping records from late September show routine traffic, timber barges, supply steamers, mail packets heading upriver before winter made navigation dangerous. One entry stands out only because it stops. The vessel was listed as a small river ship, shallow draft, coal-fired, built for night travel. Her registered name appears once in a handwritten ledger, then never again. No arrival recorded. No damage reported. No insurance claim filed. Just a departure time and an empty line beneath it. Witness testimony places the ship leaving a riverside landing shortly after dusk. The sky was clear, moon thin, the kind of night pilots preferred when fog stayed low and predictable. A dockhand named Walter Klein later told a county clerk that the ship's captain delayed departure by nearly an hour, standing at the rail as if listening for something upriver. When asked what he meant, Klein said only, like he didn't want to meet it. The Missouri River at that point narrowed into a long, wooded bend where sound traveled poorly. Locals referred to it as a dead stretch, not because ships wrecked there often, but because nothing ever lingered. Boats passed through and left no trace. Even debris moved on quickly. According to the ship's manifest, she carried no passengers. Only freight, dry goods, barrels of lamp oil, and sealed crates marked for a trading post farther north. The crew numbered 5, all experienced rivermen. Their names appear in payroll books from earlier that year. None appear again. A farmer on the eastern bank claimed he saw the ship's lanterns drifting steadily into the bend, then dimming, not abruptly, but as though swallowed by distance. He waited for the sound of the paddle wheel to return downstream. It never did. His statement was taken weeks later when questions finally began to circulate. By morning, the ship was overdue. By evening, she was missing. River authorities assumed grounding or collision. Search crews moved cautiously along both banks, scanning for splintered wood or oil slicks. They found nothing. No wreckage, no cargo, no bodies. Even the river logs, usually meticulous, offered no clues. The current that night had been steady, weather fair, no reports of fire or distress. As days passed, the disappearance became harder to classify. Ships sank on the Missouri River. That was not unusual. What unsettled investigators was the silence. The river had given nothing back. Newspapers framed the incident as delay at first, then loss. One small article referred to the Missouri River's long history of keeping secrets, a line lifted from earlier reports about vanished barges and unmarked graves along its banks. The tone was cautious. No blame assigned. No theory favored. By the end of October, the ship was officially listed as missing. Not destroyed, not recovered, just gone. And in the Ozarks, where rivers cut deep and records thin quickly, that distinction mattered. The search began without urgency and ended without answers. River patrols worked outward from the last confirmed sighting, probing sandbars and back channels where boats were known to catch. Divers were never deployed. The Missouri was too unpredictable, its visibility too poor. Instead, crews relied on poles and hooks, dragging the riverbed in places where wreckage usually gathered. They found none. County records show a growing confusion rather than alarm. The absence of debris suggested the ship had not broken apart. The lack of oil or coal residue argued against fire. Even grounding seemed unlikely, as no stranded vessel was reported along either bank. The river had absorbed the ship cleanly, without the evidence it normally left behind. Attention turned to the crew. Payroll books confirmed that all 5 men had collected wages earlier that month. A boarding house ledger in Jefferson City recorded 2 of them checking out the day before departure. None were known to have enemies. None carried debts large enough to suggest flight. Their families filed inquiries, not accusations. They wanted confirmation more than justice. A river marshal named Elias Trent was assigned to coordinate information. His notes survive in fragments preserved among unrelated correspondence. Trent wrote that he found no sign of panic, struggle, or error in the ship's preparations. Supplies were stocked correctly. The boiler inspection was current. Navigation charts showed nothing unusual about the route that night. One entry stands out. Trent noted that several pilots refused to run the same stretch after sunset in the weeks following the disappearance. When pressed, they cited nothing specific, only a sense that the river there had closed up. Trent underlined the phrase and added a question mark. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some claimed the ship had been taken by smugglers operating along the banks, though no cargo ever surfaced on the black market. Others suggested the crew staged the disappearance to avoid debts, yet no one was ever cited elsewhere under assumed names. A few locals whispered about sinkholes beneath the riverbed, voids that could swallow a vessel whole. Geologists consulted later dismissed the idea as unlikely, though not impossible. The Missouri River itself offered no cooperation. Water levels remained consistent. No sudden changes were recorded. Logs from other ships passing through the bend reported nothing more than an unusual quiet, as if sound dampened sooner than expected. One pilot wrote that his engine noise felt smaller there, though he could not explain why. By November, the case stalled. The ship was reclassified from missing to presumed lost. That distinction closed insurance questions without closing the story. No cause was listed. No remains identified. Families were advised to prepare for the worst without being told what that worst might be. The river marshal moved on to other duties. His final note on the matter reads simply, "No trace located. River retains." In the Ozarks, that phrasing carried weight. The river had always been known to take things, land, boats, sometimes people, but it usually returned something in exchange. This time, it had not. And as winter approached, the bend where the ship entered the night grew quiet again, as though nothing had ever passed through it at all. As winter settled over the Ozarks, the disappearance began to change shape in the telling. Officially, the matter was dormant. Unofficially, it was becoming something else, an absence that resisted ordinary explanation. River traffic slowed, but it did not stop. Boats continued to pass the bend where the ship vanished, though captains adjusted their schedules to ensure daylight crossings whenever possible. A pattern emerged in pilot logs from late 1900 into early 1901. Several entries referenced minor delays at the same stretch of river, often attributed to fog that should not have been present or to a sudden loss of orientation. One pilot wrote that the river there looked wider than it measured. Another noted that shoreline lanterns appeared farther apart than charts suggested. None of these remarks triggered formal review. They were filed as navigational quirks. County newspapers revisited the story only briefly, usually in columns recounting local curiosities. One article described the missing vessel as another of the river's debts, never collected. The phrasing implied resignation rather than fear. Readers were reminded that the Missouri River had been claiming ships since before records were kept. Yet among those who worked the water, the silence surrounding the case felt deliberate. A deckhand testified years later that talk of the missing ship was discouraged aboard working vessels. Not forbidden, just avoided. "You don't argue with a thing that won't answer," he said. The comment appears in a later oral history transcript, recorded without follow-up. A small development briefly reignited attention in February. A fisherman found a crate lodged against a downstream snag, its markings weathered but legible. The crate matched the general description of cargo carried by the missing ship, though no serial numbers survived to confirm it. When opened, it was empty. No oil residue. No splintering consistent with impact. Authorities logged the find and moved on. River Marshal Elias Trent made one final attempt to document the site before transferring out of the district. His notes from that visit are sparse. He recorded the time of day, the water level, and the weather. He also noted an absence of sound, no insects, no bird calls for the duration of his stop along the bank. The note ends abruptly, as though the observation embarrassed him. By spring, the case had slipped fully into local memory. Children along the riverbanks were warned not to wander near the bend after dusk. Fishermen avoided anchoring there overnight. None of this was enforced. It was simply observed. The ship itself remained unaccounted for. No wreck surfaced downstream. No debris washed ashore during floods. The river kept its surface clean. And slowly the question shifted. Not how the ship was lost, but where the night had taken it. By the spring of 1901, the river had risen and fallen twice without revealing anything new. Flood season usually brought answers: broken timbers, cargo fragments, sometimes bodies carried far from where accidents occurred. This year, the Missouri offered nothing. The bend where the ship disappeared remained unchanged, its banks intact, its current steady and indifferent. Attention shifted briefly to records rather than water. A county clerk reviewing shipping manifests noticed that the missing ship's registration number did not appear in renewal lists for the following year. This was not unusual for a lost vessel, but the absence of follow-up paperwork was. Normally, a loss generated correspondence, insurance claims, legal filings, ownership transfers. Here there was only silence. The clerk noted it in the margin and did nothing further. Families of the crew gathered once quietly in late April. They met not to accuse but to compare what little they knew. Each had received the same response from authorities: no evidence, no recovery, no timeline. One widow recalled her husband mentioning the river listening back on his final trip. At the time, she had assumed it was fatigue. In retrospect, the comment took on a different weight. It was written down later, in a letter that circulated privately among the families. That same month, a steamboat pilot reported an unusual incident while passing the bend at dawn. His engine stalled briefly, then restarted without intervention. He claimed the delay felt longer than it measured. When he checked his pocket watch, it showed no lost time. The report was filed as mechanical irregularity. No inspection was ordered. Folklore began to harden around the absence. Locals spoke of the river there as if it were narrower than it appeared, or deeper than charts allowed. Some suggested old channels beneath the current, remnants of earlier courses the river no longer acknowledged. Others recalled native stories of waterways that led away rather than onward. These accounts were shared cautiously, framed as history rather than explanation. River traffic resumed its usual pace by early summer, though habits had changed. Pilots reduced speed. Crews lowered voices. Lanterns were kept dimmer than regulations required. None of this was mandated. It spread the way practical knowledge often does, without instruction. A traveling surveyor passing through the region later remarked that the bend felt unfinished, as though the river there had not decided what it was meant to be. He offered no measurements to support the claim. He did not return. By mid-1901, the case was officially considered closed. No announcement marked the decision. It simply stopped being discussed in formal settings. The river ship that entered the night remained absent from every ledger that mattered. And yet, among those who worked the Missouri, the bend never quite returned to being just another stretch of water. It became a place you passed through, not a place you occupied. a place where something had gone in, and the night had chosen not to give it back. The summer of 1901 brought heavy traffic back to the river, but it also brought restraint. Pilots who had worked the Missouri for decades began adjusting routes in small, almost unspoken ways. They slowed before the bend. They avoided stopping there after sunset. None of this appeared in official navigation advisories. It lived instead in habit, passed between crews without instruction. A set of handwritten pilot journals from that year reveals a subtle shift in language. Entries near the bend became shorter, less descriptive. Weather conditions were noted without comment. Distances were recorded precisely, yet descriptions of sound and visibility disappeared altogether. One pilot wrote simply, "Passed through without incident." The phrase appeared repeatedly, as though reassurance itself had become necessary. In August, a curious claim surfaced from a riverside settlement several miles downstream. A man reported seeing lantern light on the water late at night, drifting against the current. He described it as steady and deliberate, not flickering like reflected starlight. When neighbors came to look, the light was gone. The report reached the county sheriff, who logged it under unverified observation and took no further action. The Missouri River had long been associated with such sightings. Logs from the 1800s contained similar accounts, often tied to wrecks or late-running packets. What unsettled those who remembered the missing ship was the timing. The light appeared along a stretch where no vessel had been recorded for months. River Marshal Trent, now reassigned, was contacted informally. He declined to return, advising instead that rivers make their own sense. The remark was later quoted out of context, giving it more weight than he likely intended. Meanwhile, the families of the missing crew marked the first anniversary quietly. No memorial service was held at the river. Instead, names were spoken in private rooms, without speculation. One family donated a small sum to improve dock lighting at a nearby landing, a gesture that felt protective rather than commemorative. A county newspaper ran a brief column noting that no trace of the ship had been found despite a year of observation. The article ended with a familiar phrase, "The Missouri keeps what it takes." Readers did not respond. As autumn approached, the bend returned to routine silence. Fish moved through, barges passed. The water showed no disturbance beyond the ordinary churn of current and wind. To an outsider, nothing marked the place as unusual. But for those who had watched a ship enter that stretch of river and fail to emerge, the night still felt closer there. Not darker, just nearer, as though the river had learned how to hold it. And with each passing season, the disappearance settled deeper into the Ozarks, long memory of things that go missing without leaving a mark. By the end of 1901, the disappearance had settled into something resembling acceptance, though no one ever used that word. The river continued its work uninterrupted, carving banks, shifting channels, carrying commerce north and south as it always had. Yet the bend where the ship vanished remained marked in the minds of those who knew the water best. County court records from that winter include an odd but telling detail. A lawsuit involving delayed freight made reference to unavoidable night conditions along the Missouri. No explanation followed. The phrase did not appear in similar cases elsewhere along the river. It was allowed to stand without clarification, as though everyone present understood what it meant. A ferry operator stationed several miles upstream testified years later that he began refusing late crossings shortly after the ship's disappearance. When asked why, he said the river there behaved differently after dark. "It answers slower," he explained. The remark drew no laughter. It drew nods. That winter, ice formed earlier than expected along the banks near the bend, though midstream remained clear. One riverman noted that the ice pattern suggested opposing currents beneath the surface, something charts did not account for. He marked the observation in his log, then crossed it out. The next page begins with a different route altogether. In January of 1902, a brief but unsettling incident occurred. A supply barge traveling downstream reported a sudden drop in engine noise while passing through the stretch shortly after midnight. The crew later insisted the engine had not failed. The sound simply vanished for several seconds, returning without explanation. No damage was found. The captain chose not to report the incident formally, sharing it only after retirement. Folklore began to crystallize around these fragments, not stories of monsters or curses, but of passage. Old rivermen spoke of places where the river did not merely carry things forward but sideways into backwaters of time and memory. These stories were told carefully, usually framed as warnings to inexperienced pilots rather than explanations. By spring, the missing ship had faded almost entirely from print. Newspapers turned to floods, trade, and politics. The Ozarks moved on as they always did, but the habits remained. Lanterns dimmed. Watches checked twice. Routes adjusted just enough to avoid lingering. No wreck was ever found. No cargo surfaced downstream. No personal effects washed ashore. Even the river's violence during flood season failed to produce evidence. It was as though the ship had slipped between moments rather than beneath water. And for those who worked the Missouri at night, that possibility lingered, quiet, unprovable, but present. A reminder that the river did not only move through the Ozarks. Sometimes it moved things away from them. By the spring of 1902, the river had erased most practical urgency, but it had not erased memory. The bend was no longer discussed as the site of a loss. It was discussed as a boundary. Pilots marked it mentally the way they marked shallow bars or hidden snags, something to be passed, not examined. A set of county affidavits collected that year for an unrelated shipping dispute contains an incidental remark. A witness, when asked why he delayed a delivery, replied that he had waited for daylight before crossing the lower bend. The court clerk noted the response but did not question it. The delay was accepted as reasonable. River traffic logs show that night crossings through that stretch dropped noticeably after 1901. No regulation enforced this change. It emerged organically, guided by experience rather than instruction. New pilots learned quickly by watching older ones hesitate. That summer, a traveling journalist researching river commerce interviewed several Missouri rivermen. When he asked about accidents, they spoke freely: groundings, boiler failures, collisions. When he mentioned the missing ship, the conversation stalled. One man said, "That wasn't an accident." Another corrected him quietly, "That wasn't anything." The journalist's published piece omitted the incident entirely. A curious report surfaced in July. A trading post downstream received an unsigned delivery of empty crates matching the dimensions of cargo listed on the missing ship's manifest. No markings remained to prove origin. The postmaster logged the delivery, then scratched out the entry when no sender could be identified. The crates were repurposed within days. The river kept no receipt. Later that year, a professor studying river morphology visited the bend to observe sediment patterns. In his notes, he remarked that the current there behaved as if diverted around an obstruction that no longer exists. He offered no explanation and did not include the observation in his final report. Stories circulated quietly among fishing camps. Some claimed to hear a paddle wheel where no ship passed. Others described a low vibration underfoot while standing on the bank at night. These accounts never agreed on detail. They agreed only on location. By autumn, the bend had resumed its outward appearance of normalcy. Leaves drifted on the surface. Barges moved through by day. Lantern light reflected cleanly off the water. To anyone unfamiliar with the story, there was nothing to see. But to those who remembered the ship entering the night and failing to emerge, The river there still felt incomplete, as though something had gone through and altered the way passage worked. And in the Ozarks, where rivers and stories alike tend to deepen with time, that alteration did not fade. It settled, quietly, into the current itself. As 1903 approached, the disappearance began to outlast the people most directly connected to it. River Marshal Elias Trent retired that winter. Two of the original search crew moved away. One of the widows remarried. Life continued, unevenly but forward. The river, however, did not seem to acknowledge the passing years in the same way. A small but persistent detail emerged in navigation records from that period. Boats passing through the bend recorded minor discrepancies in distance, fractions of a mile gained or lost between fixed markers. Surveyors attributed this to shifting channels, but the explanation did not satisfy those who ran the river daily. The water had shifted before. This felt different. In March, a steamboat carrying mail northbound reported arriving ahead of schedule despite maintaining normal speed. The captain double-checked his logs and found no error. He noted the anomaly, then added almost as an afterthought, "crossed Lower Bend at night." The note was not flagged. Local folklore adapted, as it often does, to fit practical needs. Parents told children not to play near the river after dark. Fishermen avoided anchoring close to the eastern bank. These habits were not attributed to fear, but to respect. The river was treated less as a hazard and more as a presence with preferences. That summer, a riverboat musician claimed to hear harmonics echoing off the bluffs where none should have been possible. He described the sound as delayed, arriving seconds after he stopped playing. The crew laughed it off. Later, the musician refused to perform while passing the bend. No reason was given. County historians compiling regional accounts in the early 1900s noted the missing ship only briefly, grouping it with other unexplained losses. Yet even in these summaries, the language shifted. The ship was not said to have sunk or wrecked. It was said to have entered the river and failed to exit it. A casual reference to the Missouri River's long memory appeared again in print that year, echoing earlier phrasing. The river was described as a place where movement does not always equal progress. Readers likely passed over the line without noticing its weight. By the end of 1903, the disappearance had become less a mystery to be solved and more a condition to be navigated. Pilots adjusted. Schedules shifted. No one waited for answers. The ship remained absent. The river remained present. And between them, the night kept its distance, close enough to be felt, far enough to avoid explanation. By 1904, the bend had acquired a kind of procedural caution. It was no longer marked on maps or mentioned in advisories, yet it influenced decisions quietly. River captains planned their schedules around it. Cargo masters delayed departures without explanation. The Missouri continued to function, but not without adjustment. A county survey conducted that year noted an unusual pattern of sediment accumulation near the eastern bank. The report suggested an abandoned obstruction beneath the waterline, perhaps the remains of an old snag or collapsed structure. Dredging was considered, then dismissed as unnecessary. No follow-up inspection occurred. One river pilot interviewed decades later claimed that compasses behaved inconsistently in that stretch after sunset. He said the needle never spun wildly, it simply hesitated as if deciding. At the time, he told no one. "You don't argue with your instruments," he said. "You work around them." A brief resurgence of interest occurred when a downstream town reported finding a length of rope tangled in reeds after a storm. The rope was old, tarred, and consistent with river use, but no identifying marks survived. Authorities logged the find and moved on. It joined a long list of objects the river returned without explanation. That autumn, a packet boat traveling south reported hearing a prolonged echo of its own whistle after passing the bend at night. The sound returned distorted, lower in pitch, and out of sequence. Crew members later disagreed about how many times it echoed. The log records only that the sound did not behave as expected. Academic interest flickered briefly when a university geographer referenced the area in a lecture on liminal waterways, places where geography and human expectation misalign. He did not cite the missing ship directly, but several listeners recognized the implication. The lecture was never published. By then, the ship had been gone long enough to outlive active grief. What replaced it was a rule of thumb: move through, don't linger. The river rewarded motion, not curiosity. Children growing up along the banks learned this instinctively. They were warned not with stories of danger but with reminders of timing. "Not now," elders would say when dusk fell near the water. The explanation never followed. As the year closed, the Missouri carried on, indifferent to the questions it had generated. Barges passed. Trade continued. The bend looked unchanged to those who did not know where to look. But for those who did, the absence remained visible, not as a gap in the water, but as a pause in expectation. A place where something had gone forward and not arrived. And the night, once entered, had proven it did not always open again on the other side. By 1905, the disappearance had settled into the background rhythm of the river, influencing behavior without demanding attention. The Missouri was still spoken of as dangerous, but the danger was no longer framed in terms of wrecks or storms. It was framed in timing. Certain hours were avoided. Certain stretches were crossed quickly and without comment. A set of river insurance records from that year reveals an odd adjustment. Premiums for vessels operating through the Ozark stretch rose slightly, despite no increase in recorded accidents. When questioned, one underwriter replied that the change reflected unquantified risk. The phrase was accepted without elaboration. That spring, a riverboat captain reported a brief loss of shoreline definition while passing the bend at night. He described the banks as present but unreachable, as though distance had expanded without movement. The sensation lasted less than a minute. His crew noticed nothing. He logged the incident privately and altered his route thereafter. Local folklore adapted again, this time shedding any remaining narrative shape. People stopped speaking of a missing ship altogether. Instead, they spoke of the river changing its mind. Fishermen blamed poor catches on it. Pilots blamed delays. No one argued. The river had always been allowed its moods. A county archivist compiling materials from the turn of the century noted that references to the missing vessel appeared only in secondary documents, letters, journals, offhand remarks. Official files had thinned to near absence. The archivist wrote in the margin, "Loss without wreck." The note was never expanded. In June, a traveling photographer attempted to capture the bend at dusk, drawn by its reputation for unusual light. He exposed several plates from the same position over the course of an hour. When developed, the images showed inconsistent shoreline alignment between frames, despite no change in camera placement. The photographer attributed the effect to error and discarded the plates. River traffic increased that summer, driven by demand farther north. Boats continued to pass through the bend without incident, yet nearly all did so in daylight. Night passages became rare enough to be remarked upon. Those few who did cross after dark shared a common description. Sound seemed to fall behind motion. Paddle wheels turned, engines worked, but the noise arrived late, trailing the vessel by seconds. No one reported fear, only dislocation. By the end of 1905, the disappearance no longer belonged to a single year or crew. It had become part of the river's working knowledge, a condition rather than an event. Something to be accounted for, not investigated. And somewhere beneath the surface, unseen and unrecovered, the absence of the ship continued to shape the way the Missouri was navigated, quietly, persistently, and without explanation. By 1906, the river had absorbed the story so thoroughly that only those who had worked it long enough remembered when the bend was just another stretch of water. For newer pilots, the caution came without context. They were told when to slow, when to speak less, when not to cross after sunset. They followed these instructions without asking why. A regional river conference held that year included a brief discussion on navigational anomalies along inland waterways. The Missouri River was mentioned in passing, described as prone to perceptual irregularities under certain conditions. No incidents were cited, no locations named. Still, several attendees later remarked that they understood exactly which stretch was being referenced. An old ledger surfaced that sprang from a defunct shipping office. Tucked between routine entries was a note referencing freight that never arrived, dated late 1900. The note did not list a vessel name. It simply read, "Consigned, not delivered, no follow-up." The handwriting matched that of a clerk long deceased. The ledger was archived without comment. Fishermen working near the bend reported changes in current behavior, eddies forming where none should, lines drifting sideways instead of downstream. These observations were practical, not speculative. Nets were adjusted, anchors reset. No one suggested dredging. Disturbing the river there felt unnecessary. A retired pilot interviewed that year for a local history project spoke carefully about the missing ship. He said he did not believe it had sunk. "Sinking leaves things behind," he explained. That didn't. When asked what he thought had happened, he shook his head. "The river doesn't always move forward," he said. The interviewer did not press him. By autumn, the bend had become quieter than surrounding stretches, even during peak traffic. Boats passed through efficiently as though eager to leave it behind. Night crossings remained rare. Lantern light reflected cleanly off the water but seemed to fade faster there, swallowed by distance. The Missouri River continued to do what it had always done: carry trade, reshape land, erase evidence. What it did not do was return the ship. No timbers surfaced. No iron fittings. No trace of coal ash or oil residue. As years passed, the disappearance no longer felt recent. It felt structural, something that had altered the river's behavior in a way charts could not capture. And for those who noticed such things, the night still felt closer at the bend. Not darker, not colder, but nearer, as though it had learned where to wait. By 1907, the disappearance had taken on the character of a settled fact, acknowledged without being discussed. The Missouri River remained busy, yet that particular stretch carried a reputation that required no explanation. Pilots altered their habits instinctively, the way one avoids a loose step without remembering when it first shifted. A small river town upstream recorded an unusual complaint that spring. Several residents claimed they could hear a low mechanical rhythm at night, faint and irregular, coming from the direction of the bend. The sound was compared to a paddle wheel turning under strain. When officials investigated, they found only moving water and wind through trees. The report was closed as environmental noise. An engineer working on riverbank reinforcement nearby noted that his measurements along the bend produced inconsistent results. Distances between fixed markers appeared to compress slightly at dusk, then return to normal by morning. He recalibrated his tools and repeated the measurements elsewhere along the river. The inconsistency did not recur. He did not publish the finding. That summer, a packet boat captain wrote in his personal journal that time felt uneven while crossing the bend after sunset. He marked the entry with a line beneath it, then added nothing more. The journal survives only in excerpts, donated years later to a county archive. No explanation accompanies the remark. The Missouri River's history was often invoked to quiet such concerns. It had shifted course countless times, erased towns and swallowed ships before. But even seasoned rivermen admitted that this disappearance lacked the familiar violence of river loss. There had been no struggle, no debris field, no aftermath to point toward. Folklore adjusted again, this time leaning toward restraint rather than fear. Old men along the banks advised younger ones to keep moving through that stretch, as though motion itself provided protection. No one spoke of what might happen if one stopped. By late autumn, the story of the missing ship appeared only in collected reminiscences, never alone, always among other oddities of river life. Yet it stood apart. Other stories ended with wreckage, rescue, or recovery. This one ended with silence. Within the Ozarks, silence often carried its own authority. It marked places best left unchanged, questions best left open. And so the bend remained, a stretch of water outwardly ordinary, inwardly adjusted around an absence that had never been explained, only accommodated. By 1908, the bend had passed fully into what older rivermen called working knowledge, facts that no longer required explanation. New pilots learned the route by imitation, not instruction. They watched where veterans slowed, where voices dropped, where lanterns were checked twice. No one framed these habits as superstition. They were simply how the river was run. A county historian compiling notes on Ozark commerce that year made a brief reference to an unaccounted vessel loss near the turn of the century. The line was followed by no elaboration, no citation. When asked later why he included it at all, he replied that leaving it out felt inaccurate. Including it felt sufficient. That spring, a barge crew reported a brief but unsettling event. While passing through the bend at dawn, they felt a sudden resistance in the water, as if the current had thickened momentarily around the hull. The sensation passed quickly. No damage occurred. The captain logged it as drag anomaly and altered nothing else. Still, he chose not to cross that stretch again before daylight thereafter. A steamboat mechanic working the region claimed that engines behaved differently near the bend, requiring subtle adjustments to maintain steady output. He described it not as malfunction, but as compensation, as though the machinery were responding to something external. His supervisor advised him not to overthink it. References to the Missouri River's history appeared again in print that year, emphasizing its tendency to erase evidence. One article noted that entire boats had vanished in earlier decades, leaving behind nothing but stories. The missing ship of 1900 was not named, but its outline was unmistakable to those familiar with the case. By late summer, a rumor circulated briefly among dockworkers that a vessel had been seen upriver matching the missing ship's description. The claim collapsed quickly. Dimensions were wrong, paint did not match, and the report lacked consistency. Still, the idea that the ship might have emerged somewhere else lingered longer than the rumor itself. The river offered no confirmation. No logs recorded an unidentified arrival. No manifests went unsigned. Whatever had entered the night years earlier did not announce its return. As autumn approached, the bend resumed its quiet efficiency. Boats passed. Trade flowed. The river showed no sign of disturbance beyond its usual churn. Yet for those who knew the story, the absence remained palpable, not as fear, but as a limit. A place where inquiry had stopped not because answers were found, but because the river had made clear it would not provide them. And in the Ozarks, that was often enough. By 1909, the disappearance had become something the river carried without effort. It no longer surfaced in conversation unless prompted, and even then it was spoken of without detail, as though specificity itself felt unnecessary. The bend was known. That was enough. A regional transportation report that year mentioned declining night traffic along certain inland routes, attributing the change to efficiency and safety preferences. No locations were named. Still, pilots reading the report understood exactly which stretch was being described. The Missouri River, particularly through the Ozarks, had taught its own lessons. That summer, a temporary navigation marker was placed near the bend after a minor grounding unrelated to the missing ship. Within weeks, the marker shifted repeatedly despite being properly anchored. Surveyors blamed current variance. When the marker was removed, no replacement was installed. Traffic continued without it. An elderly riverman, interviewed informally by a local writer, offered a rare reflection. He said the river had learned a shortcut years earlier, one that did not follow the map. When asked what he meant, he smiled and said only that the water remembered where it had taken something whole. The writer chose not to include the quote in his article. Fragments of the original investigation surfaced occasionally in archives, usually misfiled among unrelated materials. A partial affidavit here, a ledger note there. None formed a complete picture. Together, they suggested an effort that had stopped not from exhaustion but from a lack of traction. The case had resisted grip. Folklore shifted again, becoming almost practical. New advice circulated among pilots. If the river feels wider than it looks, don't slow down. If sound carries strangely, keep your heading. These were not warnings of danger, but instructions for passage, methods for not engaging with whatever the river had chosen to hold. By the end of 1909, the missing ship no longer felt recent, yet it did not feel past. It occupied a kind of permanent present within the river's working memory, something that had happened and was still happening in a way that did not require repetition. The Missouri flowed on, unchanged in appearance, altered only in how it was approached. And the bend remained what it had quietly become, a threshold rather than a place. A point where something entered the night and left behind only the knowledge that not all journeys continue forward. By 1910, the disappearance had crossed a quiet boundary, from memory into routine. The river no longer needed reminders. Its patterns had been adjusted long enough to feel permanent. Those who worked it rarely mentioned the missing ship at all. They behaved as though the river had already explained itself. A state commerce bulletin that year referenced improvements in river efficiency, noting fewer night incidents along inland routes. The explanation given was better training and discipline. No one challenged this. No one added that discipline often grows from absence rather than instruction. An aging river clerk, sorting records before retirement, paused over the 1900 ledger where the ship's final entry appeared. He later told a colleague that the ink there looked unfinished, as though the pen had hesitated. He closed the book and did not reopen it. That summer, a dredging proposal briefly surfaced for a nearby stretch of the Missouri. Engineers debated whether disturbing the riverbed near the bend might improve navigation. The idea was dismissed quietly, without formal objection. The minutes record only that conditions did not warrant interference. No one elaborated on what those conditions were. A ferry operator downstream reported an odd sensation while crossing at night, a momentary feeling of being overtaken while standing still. The crossing completed normally. His watch showed no discrepancy. He chose to alter his hours afterward. Stories told to children along the river had shifted tone by then. They were no longer warnings about drowning or currents. They were reminders about timing. Daylight is for crossing, elders would say. No explanation followed. None was required. By autumn, the bend had fully lost its association with loss and gained something quieter, authority. It dictated behavior without demanding belief. People adjusted without thinking themselves superstitious. Within the 50-year window of this record, no trace of the ship ever emerged. Not in flood, not in drought, not in fire or collapse. The Missouri River, known for returning what it takes in broken pieces, had returned nothing at all. And in the Ozarks, where land and water have always shaped human movement more than intention, that absence endured, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a condition to be respected. a place where the Knight had accepted a ship and chosen not to release it. By 1911, the bend had become a fixed element in the mental maps of those who worked the Missouri, though it appeared no differently on paper. Charts showed ordinary depth, ordinary width. What they could not show was restraint. The way crews prepared themselves before passing through, checking lamps and gauges with unnecessary care, speaking only when needed. A riverboat inspector conducting routine checks that year noted nothing mechanically wrong with vessels that avoided night travel through the Ozark stretch. When asked why so many captains preferred daylight, one replied, "Because the river listens better then." The inspector wrote nothing down. That spring, a minor flood altered the banks upstream, tearing loose debris that traveled miles before lodging against trees and sandbars. Searchers expected remnants of older wrecks to surface, as they often did during high water. None appeared near the bend. The river rearranged itself without revealing anything it held beneath. A small local paper published a retrospective on river losses in June. It listed fires, collisions, and sinkings by name and date. One entry stood apart, marked only as unaccounted. No vessel name followed. Readers familiar with the story did not need one. A traveling lecturer on American waterways spoke in Jefferson City later that year. He described rivers as selective archives, preserving some events while erasing others completely. The Missouri, he said, was particularly adept at this. Several audience members later remarked that the lecture felt less academic than confessional. By late summer, the first generation of young pilots who had never known the river before the disappearance took command of their own boats. They inherited habits without context. They slowed where others slowed. They avoided stopping where others avoided stopping. None of them could explain why. In private correspondence, a retired pilot wrote that the river had learned a silence after 1900. He did not mean quiet in sound, but in response. Questions no longer echoed back. They simply ended. As the year closed, the bend looked unchanged, trees thick along the banks, water moving steadily through. Barges passed without incident. Trade continued. To anyone unfamiliar with the history, it was an unremarkable stretch of river, but for those who remembered, it remained a threshold, a place where something had entered the night and altered how passage itself was understood. And the Missouri River, indifferent to explanation, continued to flow, carrying with it the knowledge that not every journey leaves a trace behind. By 1912, the disappearance had reached a strange kind of completion, not resolution but settlement. The river no longer reacted to inquiry, and inquiry itself had thinned to habit. What remained was a pattern of avoidance so ordinary it no longer felt deliberate. A county transportation review that year included a marginal note from an inspector who had worked the Missouri for decades. He wrote that certain stretches of the river governed behavior without instruction. No locations were listed. The note was never expanded upon, yet it was not removed. An aging pilot, preparing to leave the river for good, told his replacement only one thing about the Ozark run: "Don't stop where the water doesn't want you." When asked how to tell, he replied, "You'll already know." The advice was accepted without question. That summer, a group of fishermen reported an unusual stillness near the bend at night. Not a lack of movement, but a lack of progression, as though the current were circulating rather than carrying. They moved on without anchoring. No one suggested returning to study it. References to the missing ship appeared once more in a private letter dated September 1912, written by a river clerk to a cousin. The clerk described the loss as the only entry I ever made that didn't point anywhere. He added that the river had not felt the same since. The letter ended abruptly and was never followed up. The Missouri River itself continued to change, banks eroded, channels shifted, sandbars formed and vanished. Yet the bend remained consistent in one regard: It returned nothing. Other wreck sites eventually gave up timbers, fittings, or bones. This one did not. By late autumn, the story had become unmoored from time. It was no longer anchored to 1900 or to the crew whose names had faded from payroll books. It existed as a condition of the river, something learned through practice rather than memory. And as the year closed, the absence that began with a single ship had become a quiet instruction. Move through, don't linger, don't ask. The night had not followed the river's usual rules. It had kept what entered it. By 1913, the story had reached the far edge of what records could hold. The Missouri River remained busy, mapped, measured, and worked, yet the disappearance from 13 years earlier had never been replaced by explanation. It had simply been absorbed, by habit, by silence, by the river's refusal to respond. A final reference appeared that year in a regional history pamphlet about Ozark waterways. In a section devoted to lost vessels, the author paused briefly on a single case, noting that one ship was never recovered nor conclusively wrecked. The sentence ended there. No speculation followed. The author seemed to understand that adding more would weaken it. Old pilots spoke less as time went on, not because memory faded, but because language failed. When asked directly about the missing ship, they often redirected the conversation to weather, trade, or safer stretches of water. One man finally said, "It's not missing, it's finished." He offered no clarification. The bend itself changed very little. Trees grew taller along the banks. The current cut deeper into familiar curves. Barges passed in daylight, efficient and uneventful. At night, the river returned to its older rhythms, dark, watchful, unconcerned with schedules. No remains were ever found. No whistle, no hull fragment, no personal effect surfaced in flood or drought. The Missouri River, known for scattering wreckage across miles of shoreline, kept this loss whole by keeping it invisible. Within the 50-year boundary of this account, that is where the trail ends. The ship that entered the night in 1900 did not sink in the way ships usually sink. It did not break apart. It did not leave evidence to argue over. It passed into something the river chose not to translate back into the world of records and recovery. And in the Missouri Ozarks, where rivers have always shaped movement more than intention, that absence remains. A quiet place in the current where nothing stops, nothing surfaces, and nothing answers. If you pass that bend today, by day or by fading light, you would see only water, trees, and the ordinary motion of the river. But those who know where to look would tell you the same thing they have told each other for years. Some nights are not meant to be crossed. Some journeys do not return, and the river remembers which ones they are.